All right, so welcome to the post-USG, the post-GA session from USG. I'm Treva Berger, I think you know that. The other people presenting today are Betsy Gabriel, Andrea Barsovic, Vanessa Lowe, we think, she's not on yet, Louise Lisi, Zachary Bosco, Dwornik, also not on yet, Tanika Berkeley, Margaret Thompson, and Lisa Dutton. Also attending GA from USG this year, but not sharing today are Reverend Kent, Ryan Hurd, Rudy Sprinkle, and John Gilmore. The session is being recorded, don't you know? So the plan is each of us will share for 5 minutes, and then there will be time for 5 minutes of questions. If you have a question, you can write it in the chat or raise your blue hand. To find your blue hand, go to the participants list, and you should see it at the bottom. Lisa is going to keep an eye on time and on the chat. So she's going to keep those of us presenting and also those question and answer times to 5 minutes so that we can finish on time. So I'm going to start with, I was going to share my screen and show you the GA page that I made so that you know that it's there and what's on it. So hold on, let me. Start with demographics. There were 4,933 total registrations this year, the third largest GA ever. It included 60 youth, which is actually low for youth, but at least there were 60 there. There were 859 congressional delegates, plus 382 ministers, 25 ministers emeritus, and 133 RE professionals, for a total of 2,399 delegates from 635 congregations in 49 states, plus Mexico and Canada. The site of Providence was chosen very intentionally on the 400-year anniversary of the landing of the Mayflower, and it was intended to be a focus on Native American tribes, indigenous peoples, excuse me. So the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe is located very near Providence, where GA was meant to be. And recently, the Department of Interior has refused to affirm the status of their reservation. So this tribe was part of the opening ceremony, and they asked all UUs to please contact their senators to ask for support of HR 312. So there's a link there for how to do that for more information, and then you just can contact your senator. There's a link there for UU The Vote. USG does have its own UU The Vote team, but I don't think it's really up and running yet. If you want to see what's happening in other places, you can check that link. Then there's a link here to the President's Report, which was about 20 minutes. I personally thought it was really inspirational and informational. A lot of times the President's Report is sort of buried in the business sessions, but I was able to get it out of the business session, so it's just the President's Report. There's also a link to the video of the Commission on Institutional Changes report, and also a link to their full report, which can be downloaded. It's 200 and some odd pages. You can also buy it as a book, but you can download it for free here and either print it or read it off a device. Betsy is going to talk a little bit more about the Commission on Institutional Change. There was a business resolution about embodying human rights in investment decisions that was put together by one of the groups or some of the groups that Vanessa's working with through the UUA. And that was passed. So there's a link there to how that reads. There were 2 actions of immediate witness. Actions of immediate witness express the conscience and carry the authority of the delegates at the GA at which they passed. They can then be used by the Unitarian Universalist Association, other UU leaders, congregations, districts, and UU organizations as a basis for public statements and are urged to be used to motivate action. So you can read the full text of each of those AIWs, they're called there. And then there were 3 proposed responsive resolutions. And responsive resolutions respond to a report that's given at GA. So the first one, Widening the Circle, is about asking that the work of anti-oppression be started with a new transformation team based on the Commission on Institutional Changes work rather than this existing group. The second one, that the youth and young adults did not attend this GA in very large numbers because they had an issue with how they were being supported and included. So there's that one, which asks for more support and inclusion of youth and young adults. And then the third one is the pandemic, a religious response, which just recommends some ways that we could be responding to the pandemic. But you can find those all at this link, proposed responsive resolutions. But Betsy's going to go over the bylaws. Lisa's going to go over Blue Harbors and Havens. And then at the bottom, there's a Google Doc where each of us who went to GA have put some of our notes so that you can see more details about the things that we're talking about today. And I think that's all I was going to say. Yep, that is it. So does anybody have any questions about any of those things?
Thank you, Treva. That's great to have all of that distilled and right there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Where's the page again? Is it like under members or something?
Yes, I'm sorry. I meant to point that out. Yes, it is. It's under members and it's called 2020 UU General Assembly Sharing. You see it there?
Yeah.
It's also linked. I can show you. It's also linked from the home page on what we call the carousel.
Yes.
That slide that has, it's the third slide, I think, but it's the slide that's got the GA emblem. I also have it linked from there.
I also did put the link at the beginning of the chat. So if you save the chat at the end, it's in there, although
Okay.
that's not going to be the easiest way to work with it going forward.
Okay.
I guess the carousel is not going to work. Any other questions about any of that?
So, Trevor, I hadn't put it on the computer until today. Can I add what I'm saying today to that Google document we had?
Yeah, absolutely. If you can't find it, you can send it to me and I'll add it. But if otherwise, you can just add it yourself. I don't know why the carousel is not working. Very odd. Anyway, any other questions before we move on to Betsy? Oh, there it goes. So it's the next slide on the carousel. So if you click this, you get to that page as well. All right. Well, there being no other questions, why don't we move on to Betsy?
Okay. We passed 2 bylaw changes at GA this year. Both of them are short and pretty straightforward. The first one I'm going to talk about is about co-moderator vacancies. Currently, the UUA board is directed or led by co-moderators, a team of 2. And the changes that will occur in that position are as follows. When multiple individuals are serving in the position of moderator, if one or more of those individuals dies, is disqualified, resigns, or is removed, the position of moderator shall be deemed vacant under section 8.7. So if one person leaves, both people have to leave, and the board will make a decision about how to fill the new position. If the position is deemed vacant, the board will be obliged, will not be obliged, but it will appoint a moderator, any remaining individual who's been serving in the position of moderator when the position was deemed vacant, and may do so either as a sole appointment or with one or more other individuals. The rationale behind going with the co-moderator 3 years ago was that it takes more than 2 people to fill that role. The current moderators both said that they spent about 30 hours a week beyond their own personal jobs in this role. And I think that it makes good sense that there be more than one person doing that. Plus it brings different perspectives. That, I don't remember the exact percentage, but I know both of these bylaws passed with over 90%. I think the co-moderator one was probably more like 95 or 98%. The second one was timing for nominating committee. Back in the olden days, when we did everything by mail, it took a lot longer for the nominating committee to come up with candidates for the board and other committees. Now that that situation does not exist, they've moved forward the deadlines for applying and distributing this information. So one change I will read. The nominating committee shall issue a report with its nominations on or before March 15th of the year in which the nominees will be candidates for election. The old date was December 10th, by the way. Nominations shall be filed with the Secretary of the Association and distributed to all certified member congregations, associate member associations, and trustees. And then the second change is very, very similar. There are other elective positions, and the date for completing that application, which is done by petition, usually it's done by congregations, and they have to have a certain number of, they have to be certified, and they have to have a certain number of individuals on the petition. But their deadline for application to serve in a volunteer position is now May 1st. And both of these, it is later than May 1st, but not earlier than October 1st. So sometimes between October 1st and May 1st. This bylaw also passed, and it was very high, somewhere in the 90s. So that's it for the bylaws. The next two things that I'm going to talk about are connected. And I think I'm going to start with the Commission on Institutional Change, or the COIC, because my next presentation was really information that was gathered and presented that happened prior to this commission being implemented. In 2017, the Board of Trustees began or put together the Commission on Institutional Change, and they served through 2020. They were initially set up for a 2-year span, but they needed more time. Sorry, it got lost. The report of this commission represents the culmination of the commissioner's work analyzing structural and systemic racism and white supremacy culture within the UUA, and makes recommendations to advance long-term cultural and institutional changes that redeems the essential promise and ideals of Unitarian Universalism. This was a 7-member commission, and they did, Treva mentioned this report a little bit earlier, but they did put together a 200 and some page report, and I have not summarized it. In fact, I haven't read the whole thing, so that's about all I'm going to say on it at this point. It is on the internet, and the portions that I looked at I thought were very interesting. So prior to that, the UUA had quite a journey, and the workshop that I attended was titled "What Happened to the Journey?" And the questions were related to anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multicultural organizations, and why, having been on this journey for such a long time, were we still where we are, I think is the underlying and final question. I will go through highlights of what happened in what years, and when I'm out of time, Lisa, let me know, because this information can be available in another format. We started in 1989 with welcoming congregations. In 1991, we created a Jubilee World, and that program started then. In 1992, there was a GA resolution at Calgary committing the UUA to racial and cultural diversity. In 1996, we worked with Crossroads, which began with a focus on training leaders within the association. In 1997, the GA passed a resolution to create the Journey Toward Wholeness Transformation Committee, which is the JTWTC. In 99, Jubilee 2 started. In 2002, we convened the JUUST Change Consultancy. This received staff support, board liaison, and funding. And let's see, in 2003, the JTWTC focused on monitoring and assessment. In 2004, ARE was developed, Allies for Racial Equality. From 2004 to 2006, this is a long one, pressure and tensions build between those who have been part of the UUA anti-racism work for a long time and new leaders with more perspectives on oppression, accessibility, LGBT, etc. In 2005, which is between 204 and 206, there was groundwork developed for youth anti-racism. And that was with consultation with the ministry to and with youth began. In 2005, GA in Fort Worth also deals with racism. In 2006, the Cultural Misappropriation Task Force began, and a Council on Cross-Cultural Engagement was developed. Again, in 2006, the Diversity of Ministry Initiative began. This was sparked by ministers of color experiencing institutional racism. And then the JTWTC, Journey Toward Wellness Something Commission, which worked on anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multicultural issues. In 2008, we developed Finding Our Way Home, and it began that year. In 2009, the UUA developed the Arc of the Universe, which was published by Standing on the Side of Love, or Standing on the Side of Love was launched. In 2010, we put out Building the World We Dream About. In 2011, the change from the JTWTC having a board relationship to with the board's right relationship in the group. Sorry, that was not clear. Change from JTWTC having a board relation to a relationship with the board's right relationship group. And in 2012, GA passes a resolution, Justice CSAI, and we renounced the doctrine of discovery.
In a minute or so.
A minute, okay. In 2013, we developed Beloved Conversations. In 2014, there was a survey sent out and all delegates were asked to pass, or the delegates passed around responsive resolution calling for recommendations to ARAOMC, anti-racism, anti-oppression, and multicultural C. I can't remember what that stands for. 2015, Green Sanctuary became a part of the UUA's Multicultural Growth and Witness staff group. The Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism was organized. And in 2016, the UUA board decided to allocate $5.3 million to Blue, BLUU. In 2017, the UUA completes a hiring process, and shortly thereafter, there was a group convened, a group of UUA staff members convened who had major problems with that. These included lack of fairness in the process, lack of trust, inadequate response to concerns raised, and racism and personal harm experienced by persons of color within our community. So I read all of that stuff to you before because it seemed amazing to us, I think, and it still seems amazing that starting this work sometime before, surely 1989, we were then in 2017, and we really didn't seem to have made progress. At least that's my read of it. I'm sure there were some things that were done. But what happened after that, there was a big staff shakeup. Several policies at the UUA were changed, and I didn't see anything written here about that, but 3 UU educators put together the White Supremacy Teach-In. The UUA then appointed, this is 2017, the Commission on Institutional Change, and that was the commission that I talked about earlier. In 2018, the Commission on COIC actually released a report on the Southern Regional Lead hiring, which is the personnel issue that I was mentioning. And here we are in 2020, and still working. So I think that probably the COIC made a lot of progress that we haven't seen yet because we haven't read about it, but that's what I had to report.
Thank you.
A question, well, I guess a statement more so than a question. So this was my first time attending GA, and it really was mind-boggling to me to hear all of these terms, and I couldn't figure out how I missed so many of these groups, or if certain things were working together or not. So hearing that chronology of different groups actually helped me understand a little bit. I guess I'm a little curious about which things are still going on concurrently, but at least I know I'm not confused with alphabet soup, that there really have been just like an enormous range of different programs and efforts and initiatives and whatever out there.
Yeah, the Allies for Racial Equity, it still continues. And the Finding Our Way Home is the People of Color, Religious Professionals of Color annual meeting, and that definitely still continues. But I think even before the 90s, there were one or two other, commissions that examined, there was one in the 60s after the UUA blew up then. So it's, it just sort of mirrors the country, but the thought now is that, we say that everybody is welcome and everybody belongs and everybody is equal, and we just need to start behaving that way.
I was amazed that I didn't know some of this, having worked for the UUA for 6 years. There was still stuff that was new to me when I listened to this seminar. I have it on, I have their slides, so if anybody in the group would like to have them, please just send me an email. I skipped a lot.
Louise, you had a question?
Well, Betsy, I admire how much you put together. So it's not my first GA, but I'm with Lisa. The alphabet soup is totally amazing.
Yeah.
Great presentation. I have a specific question about the moderators. So both moderators have to leave if the other one leaves. And the board appoints new moderators. But do they have the option to reappoint the moderator who just left or not?
Yes, they can do that. They can appoint anybody they want.
And what's the idea behind that? Is it that moderators have to have a certain synergy, or?
Certainly they would look at the synergy within the two that they choose as moderators. They're going to look for different skills. They're going to look for the ability to work together. So yeah, if they go with a co-moderator team, which I can't imagine they won't, given how much work is involved. They're looking for different perspectives, but great leadership skills.
Any other questions? Comments, thoughts? All right, we'll move on to Andrea Barsovic.
Okay, well, what I'm going to talk about are really just my reflections on the General Assembly. And I started writing this, and then I had a little accident, and so it sort of ground to a halt immediately, but I'll read to you what I have. They're my reflections on UUA General Assembly 2020. So how does one describe the UUA General Assembly? My husband likes to refer to General Assembly, or GA, as a giant festival. If you need spiritual nourishment, there are daily church services as well as mindfulness sessions. If church governance is your thing, delegates from every congregation come together to debate resolutions, make policies, and respond to national and international issues. For those who love music, there are musical experiences and workshops and a choir to participate in. For every aspect of church governance, there are workshops galore. Because of COVID-19, it was unclear if this year's event would have the same feel as previous GAs. Despite the virtual approach, GA retained much of its charm for me. The theme of the 2020 GA is rooted, inspired, and ready. As I looked over the agenda of selections, what I saw was an emphasis on the historical oppression of Native peoples and people of color, as well as current examples of the same. The opening ceremony featured the Mashpee Wampanoag people of Rhode Island, whose land has been taken over and occupied by European pilgrims and their descendants. Despite this oppression, the overall message of the GA was hopeful. We can look to our ancestors for inspiration, and another world is possible. I go to GA to be inspired. The events that I can always count on to inspire me are the worship services. This year, the Sunday worship service was led by Reverend Joan Javier Duvall, whom I know because she spent a year as a ministerial intern at USG. She has gone on to lead the UU Church in Montpelier, Vermont. One of the hymns during the service took up the rhythm and drumbeat of Native peoples. It's called We Are by Reverend Yaseh Barnwell. And just some of the words are, for each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. We are our grandmother's prayers. We are our grandfather's dreaming. We are the breath of our ancestors. We are the Spirit of God. We are one. She started out by reminding us that this year is the 400th anniversary of the founding of the Plymouth Colony and the beginning of the occupation of Wampanoag lands by pilgrims. As Universalists, Unitarian Universalists, we must grapple with this, she said. The title of Reverend Jones' sermon was Beyond the Water's Edge. She talked about the Montpelier Church where she is rooted and about the rivers that flow through the town and flow to the St. Lawrence and ultimately into the ocean. She used a poem about crossing over a river to liberation as inspiration for her sermon. One of the ideas in the poem is that bridges to liberation are built on the bodies of those who are lost. Liberation is costly and it is compelling, and we are drawn toward it, she said. When the people in the poem get to the land of liberation, or the person in the poem gets to the land of liberation, she is told this is heaven. When she asks where it is, she's told it is on earth. And when she asks when, she is told in the future. Reverend Joan talked about being ready to bridge that future of liberation. Being ready means trying, making mistakes, and asking forgiveness, embracing our interdependence, working for our collective good and our collective liberation. She quoted Reverend Teresa Soto, all of us need all of us to make it. The service ended with Emma's Revolution singing their anthem, Keep on Moving Forward, Never Looking Back.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anybody have questions for Andrea?
Margaret has her hand up.
Oh, she put that up because I told everybody I thought I wanted their hands up, but then I realized if people had questions, then I just put asterisks instead. You know, I wanted to say, Andrea, that you said that the Wampanoag's land was occupied by people, but basically all of the land in this country has been occupied. So people, when they introduce themselves at GA, would say, you know, like, I'm from Philadelphia, formerly the land of the Lenape. And so I did look that up, and we are on formerly Lenape land.
Yeah. Can I add in that there's a URL going around that was going around at GA, so people could look up whose land where they live was originally, and I put that URL in my report in the web document.
Oh, good. I'd just like to thank Andrea for reviewing that service, because I'm sure we all saw it, and then having it to kind of experience it again, to have you bring it back to mind. It was a very powerful service. Yeah.
The other line that I really liked, and I think it was in what she said, is we cannot await a predictable future, because so often, you know, things aren't quite there and you still want this or that, but some things just require immediate action, and, you know, you need to clean it up as you go along. And I thought she did a good job of relaying that point too.
Yeah, Louise, I think you can unmute yourself now, but I will ask you to unmute. I don't have hope people can.
I don't know why. It just, I put it on, I like putting it on mute when somebody else is talking, and for some reason it kept saying that I cannot unmute myself.
Huh. No worries. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, Andrea, I'd also like to thank you. If that was just the beginning of your writing, that's overwhelming. It was just beautiful.
Yep. Anybody else?
Well, I don't want to leave Betsy out, but I really thank you, Betsy, for the kind of the history that you gave us of things that have been going on in the UUA. There have been some articles in our journal that have gone over those things, but again, I just appreciate your synopsis of it. And I wish there were more people here to hear all of what you have to say. I'm glad you're recording this.
Yeah, hopefully people will watch it. I don't know if they got locked out or if they just, it's a beautiful day and they were done with church. Did you want to say something, Tanika, or you just wanted to be able to say something?
Oh yeah, just to be unmuted. And I was there for that service too, and I found that poem really, the whole story was just very moving, and very hopeful too as well.
All right, so we were going to go to Vanessa, but she is not here. I emailed both she and Zachary just to see, I don't know, I haven't had a response. So Louise, you're up.
Okay. Well, to me, 2 noon lectures were very exciting because the 3 speakers are educating people about the United States history of erasure and exclusion of indigenous peoples. The first speaker was historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote the book An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. Later, she was joined by Jean Mendoza to write An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States for Young People. And educator Natalie Martinez of La Cuna Pueblo wrote An Educator's Guide to the Indigenous Peoples of the History of the United States. And the Jean Mendoza and Natalie Martinez spoke the second day. So there were 2 different lectures. The messages in these talks included that we stand on land that was not empty before Europeans came. And I forgot to ask whether I'm talking close enough to the microphone.
Better now that you're closer.
It's better.
Yes.
Should I repeat it? Did you hear what I said?
Yes, we could hear.
I'm just muting a few people just to check. There is some background sort of echoey stuff, and I don't know where it's coming from. So I'm just poking around to see if I can figure it out. Go ahead, Louise.
Okay, so the messages in these talks included that we stand on land that was not empty before Europeans came. People lived here and had lived here for millennia. Looking at history from the viewpoint of the people who were displaced is very different from the teaching about how the European and European American settlers battled the, in quotes, savages to acquire the land that the settlers wanted. Now, the doctrine of discovery has already been mentioned, and the doctrine of discovery was discussed by Roxanne. At GA in 2019 in Spokane, I learned that the doctrine of discovery had been repudiated by UUGA in 2012, which Betsy has already mentioned. I had not looked up the doctrine of discovery until after Roxanne's lecture. In that lecture, she talked about an 1823 Supreme Court case under Chief Justice John Marshall. The decision said that the title to lands lay with the government whose subjects during the age of discovery traveled to and occupied a territory whose inhabitants were not subjects of a European Christian monarch. So I knew there was something wrong with the doctrine of discovery, but it wasn't until I just looked it up that I got the exact definition. So these authors talked about settler colonialism as a taking over of land and or bodies. The settlers of the colonies and of the later westward expansion was taking over land that was, in quotes, considered empty. African slavery was taking over African bodies that were considered property, not human bodies. After each of these lectures, I recognized one difference between virtual GA and real GA. If it was actual GA, I would have run right to the exhibit hall after these talks. And these books, you know, all 3 of them, you know, the original Indigenous history and the Young People's one and the Educator's Guide would have been there to look at. And the educators, Natalia and Jean, also talked about children's books that are useful to have intergenerational discussions about issues of indigenous peoples. And one example she used were books that discuss land, air, and water. And there is a handout that's accessible in our portal, and I don't know exactly how to put that up, and maybe I can put that up separately, Tag, because there were several children's books specifically listed. Now, now I went to a related workshop, number 204, which was titled Colonialism's Impact on Palestinians and on Indigenous North Americans. There were 4 speakers at the workshop. I think I would have to go back and listen to them all again very carefully to write more about it, and I'm certainly willing to write more about it. But both the United States and the current state of Israel are settler colonialist powers. Now I switched topics. The last workshop I'm going to mention is number 402, Empowering Young Leaders and Building Multi-Generational Movements. Now, I thought this would emphasize working together out in the community and, you know, broad society issues like ending nuclear weapons or a world without war, anti-racism, climate change. The discussion was much more about local churches and regional groups of churches and the UUA. There is much history, and I do not understand all of it, but there was a definite feel that, you know, back maybe in the 80s and 90s, that there was a more effective support for youth leaders, and there were pictures of groups meeting together as youth, and now a lot of them are leaders in the church. And if I heard it correctly, and Betsy probably knows exactly, there was talk about defunding of youth programs by UUA in about 2006. On a local level, there was discussion about youth being involved in committees and on boards, and certainly this is something we can discuss at USG, because it's asking, do you have youth on committees in the church? Do you have a youth representative on the board? You know, on a personal level, I know that when my daughter was in high school, she was a youth representative to the then Joseph Priestley District Board. So it brought up a lot of questions to me about what are we doing. And of course, there's a good background to the resolution that Betsy mentioned about, you know, the funding for more support for youth.
Thanks, Louise. I'll unmute everybody for questions. Some of you I have to ask to unmute, others of you I can unmute. And I do have it checked that everybody can unmute themselves, so I'm not sure why. But anyway, questions for Louise?
I'm curious, Louise, why you picked those particular workshops.
Well, I'm very active in a group called Christian Jewish Allies discussing the Israel-Palestine situation. So of course I was interested in the workshop on that involved Palestinians and North American indigenous peoples. And I don't know, the situation in Israel-Palestine can be so totally discouraging, but when you put it together on a more worldwide issue and just see indigenous peoples in the United States being active, and the Palestinians and the indigenous peoples in the United States definitely communicate with each other, and there's a lot of empathy and understanding. When you start to look at the worldwide implications of colonialism, it seems like the solution will be a worldwide effort to, you know, have a life that is different from colonialism. And I picked the two noon lectures because it was the same topic about the history of indigenous people, and the idea that somebody wrote a book which gives a totally different view of history was so exciting. And the educator who spoke, she gave specific examples of dealing with children in, like, I say middle school classrooms and asking questions about why is this person X not discussed in terms of, you know, getting the vote for Native peoples in New Mexico. And they can't find that person. And then they go on to discuss, well, you have to go to alternative sources because our history books don't include, you know, a lot that we need to know.
Andrea, did you have a question?
I just wanted to make a comment. I also attended the lecture by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz about her book about the history of Native peoples. And I thought it was really incredible. I mean, her critique is, I think, really very cutting and also very on target. And she even brought it up to the current day with her discussion of the musical Hamilton. And, you know, so I think that book, I think, is going to be very worthwhile to read. I thought it was a really good presentation. I didn't hear the part about the young people, that section of it, but the original work, I think, is what her discussion of it was wonderful.
Well, since it's all recorded, I think you would very much enjoy the second discussion. That was the FOS lecture the following day.
Mm-hmm.
And she went on to mention, you know, also Mexico, but I mean, I limited what I said. It was supposed to be 5 minutes, which seems incredibly short. It's somebody else had a question, I think.
I actually sorry.
Yep. Louise, you know, this revisionist history, you inspire me to read more of it. I've read the Nathaniel Philbrook's book Mayflower this summer, and it is a very different view of colonialism and really brings out the real damage that colonialism does. And I remember my own history instruction where we were kind of taught that colonialism was a good thing, that it did good things for people. And this revisionist history has been quite a journey.
We're going to do the Indigenous Peoples History in the Racism Book Study Group at some point this fall. We have a couple of books before that, but I ordered 5 copies each of the adult version and the young people's version, and I can order more if we have more people. The young people's version just has a lot of maps and pictures and things, but is basically apparently almost equivalent, and lots of adults are reading it just because it's a little bit more, you know, accessible.
Can I add a small side note?
Yeah.
When my when we were getting ready to send my child to kindergarten, so this is like 20 years ago, I was talking to the family of one of their friends from preschool who were looking at Germantown Friends School for their child, partly because the father was an alum. And what they were told about incorporating information about total American history or total world history was that, and remember, this is 20 years ago, so I don't know how it is now, that they have a perfectly satisfactory curriculum for the whole school that sounded very Eurocentric and almost the same as the curriculum that the father had been exposed to when he was a student there.
Mm.
No space for more African American or Indigenous people's history.
Any other questions for Louise?
I was thinking to further answer, I think it was Sarah's question about how did I get interested. Actually, the issue of you know, justice for Palestine, Israel, you know, very much is credited to USG getting my interest in that, because there was a group, Unitarian Universalists for Just Peace in Palestine, Israel, and there's a national group, but we don't currently have a local group. But in 2016, USG's sponsor and was a site for meeting for the course Why Palestine Matters. It was run by Christian Jewish allies. And that's really how I got this interest to start.
And I've let everyone go significantly over since we started late, but now we're down to having 3 speakers left and about a half hour left. So we're really going to have to be a little closer to the 5 minutes. And just keep in mind that we do have the notes available, so that way we can get to the end.
All right, so Tanika is up.
Hey everyone, hi. So the presentation I went to was entitled Hospitality, Reparations, and Our First Principle. Can you hear me okay? Okay. So the workshops mostly center around how to make congregations more inviting for people of color, African Americans, the LGBTQI folks, and indigenous communities. In addition to looking at the national case for reparations and linking the push for reparations to upholding the first principle. And most of the people that were on the panel were from, I guess, the hospitality committee. And so these were some of the recommendations that they put forth in the commission report on institutional change. So they echoed what a few other people who spoke today have said about young people and needing to make space for young people so that they feel like they're a part of the congregation. They want to promote providing travel and funding opportunities for Black, POC, Indigenous, and LGBTQI members. And they want to push for prioritizing the voices of the most marginalized. So that means continuing funding for, and this goes back to the alphabet soup committees that we were talking about before, DRUM, which is Diverse and Revolutionary UU Multicultural Ministries, BLUE, Black Lives and Unitarian Universalism, TRUST, which is Transgender Religious Professional UUs Together, and Equal Access, which deals with disabilities and access. So they said traditionally in the church, historically marginalized groups were made to feel welcome, but it was under the caveat of you're welcome here as long as you act like us. And caucusing about 25 years ago wasn't really wanted because they wanted to focus on making the congregation feel like everyone was unified, and not separating in groups. But the marginalized groups then pushed for needing to feel unity and solidarity within their own groups. And so they started to create these caucuses based off that. So as far as the reparations dialogue is concerned, their understanding of reparations is repair and restoration of whole communities. And there are 4 pillars, our institutions, colleges and universities, government, and churches. And so they believe that reparations should be dispersed within those 4 pillars of society. And they're looking towards an organization called NCOBRA, which is the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America. They're leading the kind of the national dialogue for what that could look like. And they've been together for quite a long time. I think the legislation was introduced in the 80s. So I think they've been around since that time. So going to looking at the first principle, which one of the components is inherent worth and dignity. The intention of reparations is to be able to restore this within our communities. Looking at the national efforts, there is a bill in the House, HR 40, which is a reparations bill, and it's titled the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans. And I put a link to the bill itself in the document. So if anyone wants to refer back to it just to see what it's about. But again, I think that was introduced in either the late 80s or the 90s. And it really hasn't gotten much traction over the years. But one of the recommendations that they put forth is that each church has its own reparations commission, and that this can be localized by states and cities, and then possibly funded through tithes and offerings, and then distributed to those marginalized groups who would be impacted. They feel that the Northeast region, so the state of Pennsylvania, including New York and Washington, D.C., is the most important region in the country to get mileage behind this. Yeah, so they feel that it's really important for those states to start to get on the bandwagon for this now. It definitely seems like that reparations is a topic that has more momentum behind it now than previously. There's a recent write-up in the New York Times in June, towards the end of June, by Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is, can you still hear me? Can you still hear me, everyone?
Mhm.
Oh, okay. I just got a notice that my speaker wasn't working. Nicole Hannah-Jones, she wrote an article that came out last year on 1619. She just recently wrote an article on reparations and why it's needed now. So you can find that in your New York Times. And then Hospitality Committee is just pushing towards making more of an effort to make congregation spaces more inclusive of marginalized groups in the community. That's it.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have questions? Somebody's making noise. Is that Margaret again?
She said no.
Does anybody have questions for Tanika?
I just wanted to share, I attended that same session, and when I read Tanika's synopsis, I thought, oh good, we'll go with yours. You were far more objective than I was, because one of the speakers, just his whole style thing turned me off. It seemed like whatever. So Tanika definitely reflected the high points and the true essence of the discussion without being sidetracked by the style.
Yeah, that particular person, he was a bit hard to follow, because he kind of kept going off on tangents, and I was like, okay, so what are you like really trying to say about it?
He even at one point said, I know people are tired of hearing about it, but it's not over until we feel like it's over. And I'm like, well, you're not going to get buy-in easily with that. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. But. Sarah, did you have a question?
I did. Tanika, when you were talking about the 4 ways for reparations, the sound got just a little garbled. And I wondered if you would do that again. Just tell us what those 4 kinds of reparations that were talked about are.
Sure. So the 4 pillars that they mentioned were institutions, colleges and universities, government, and churches. So like if we take colleges and universities, maybe there are certain allowances that will be made for Indigenous students, students of color, African Americans or LGBTQ. Any of those students would be affiliated with a marginalized community.
Okay.
So would institutions include schools? Because it's good to talk about colleges and universities, but we need really great pre-K, K to 12 education. So would that be included under institutions?
Yeah, and I think that's what the difficulty is like visualizing and formalizing what this is going to look like. Because it would represent like change on so many different levels. And so how do we envision what that's going to look like and how it's going to be distributed? Because people mostly think of it as like financial compensation, and that's so minimal. I mean, compared to, like you said, with education, like how do you revamp the educational system so that marginalized communities are actually invested in the process and actually see themselves reflected in education? So, you know, and so, I mean, that if you go to like textbooks, then that means whole textbooks have to be rewritten. And, you know, the textbook industry is a multi-million-billion-dollar industry.
Yeah.
So to halt that and then rewrite, you know, the whole process, that would take time, it would take legislation. So that's looking at the process from not just education, but from a university system and how that's structured, and how that is currently dealing with marginalized communities as far as like attendance to universities, and how do we change that? So I mean, it's a lot, that has to be taken into consideration.
One of the things I learned from being an educator was that the people who purchase the textbooks often won't buy a book that doesn't say what they want it to say. And, I see that as a big problem. And my experience was with the concept of evolution, that textbooks wouldn't use the word because then Texas wouldn't buy it. And so that's one area where I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head. People have to be willing to expose their kids to revisionist history.
Exactly. Yeah. And the book.
Really should go to the next speakers because we're getting.
Oh, sorry. No.
Right. All right. That
Margaret?
that would be Margaret. Did you want to finish your sentence, Tanika?
Oh no, it's cool.
Okay.
Yeah. We can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. I wanted to add in, since Vanessa wasn't able to be here today, that I attended her session on Saturday, and I highly recommend, which talked about, half of it was about the fund that UU churches and organizations can invest in and know that their investments are being used responsibly. And then Vanessa spoke about a community investment fund that actually allows churches to invest directly in their communities. So I really encourage people to look at what Vanessa wrote up, because she includes all the details and the links. And I am pulling up my notes. I went to 2 workshops. One was called Why We Want and Resist Diversity. And the presenters were Patrice Curtis and Keith Cron. They emphasized that congregations are made up of people, and they reviewed a lot of the ways that psychologically people resist change and organizations resist change, and can give you some insight into why for decades Unitarian Universalists have been working toward diversity and yet have not made a lot of progress. He focused on congregations. Patrice focused more on how individuals resist change. He shared a model about different people's mindsets toward change and being welcoming towards people who aren't perceived as being part of the majority culture, particularly people, Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color who don't look like the majority white congregation. It's kind of complicated. I would encourage people to look at my summary, because I don't think I can do justice to it in 5 minutes. And the way he described the categories were they kind of, in mindset, they're kind of similar, and people who think more similarly, who are in adjacent groups, can talk to each other and understand each other. And there is where the space for change is. People who are widely separated in how they think about people who are different talk past each other. Keith also emphasized that change is a slow process, as we all are aware of. And he quoted Ron Chisholm, who wrote Undoing Racism. We are willing to move slowly because we have so little time. Patrice talked about how we are at war within ourselves, how everyone has unconscious and or implicit bias. But biases can be changed through awareness of biases, exposure to new experiences, and a willingness to challenge ourselves. Change often needs to be reinforced through practice. You don't get it the first time. You learn to do it better as you try out different mindsets, different behaviors. There also needs to be compassion for making mistakes, because everybody makes mistakes. And she specifically said compassion for ourselves and for mistakes of other people. In the presentation, they recommended How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi. They also pointed out that he has written books about raising anti-racist babies and anti-racist children.
1 minute.
The other presentation was called Building Resilience for White Folks for Uncomfortable Conversations. It was presented by a panel of people from Allies for Racial Equity, which is an organization of white people doing anti-racist work within the UU movement. It is an accountability relationship with DRUM, Diverse Radical Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries. They emphasized that their leadership cooperative works on the starfish model. They talked about, again, everyone is human, people make mistakes. It's really important to work on expanding your awareness, understanding the experience of people who are different than you. They also really emphasized building relationships with other white people. And again, the talk was aimed at white people. Relationships with other white people who are working toward change and who can help each of us process mistakes we've made so we can do better in the future. And it sounded like ARE wants to help provide a network so people can get to know other people doing the work. They also emphasized that ally isn't action. And I included in my write-up the URL for Allies for Racial Equity. They also recommended Shelley Totchluck's Living in the Tension and Beloved Conversations from Meadville to Lumbar. Did I make it within the 5 minutes?
No, that was 7.5, but we have
Thank you.
Q&A.
Does anybody have any questions for Margaret?
Just thank you. And I'm willing to stay and listen to this a little longer. I mean, you guys are doing such a wonderful job. And I don't want to see anybody cut off for lack of time if you don't feel a need to stop.
I don't have a question for Margaret as much as one of the comments you made, I can't remember exactly which one, but in terms of people being more flexible when mistakes happen, I really see that present itself at USG sometimes. I've been in some discussions where if someone describe something or use a terminology, and then they're just cut off by someone. Oh, you shouldn't say that, da, da, da. And I don't like that. I don't feel comfortable with that. I mean, I feel like generally when people come in the room to participate in the discussion, often people are there because they want to learn, and we really should be more supportive to help educate, share information. And even if you're not personally the one rebutting, try to help whoever's talking that way, creating so much tension, kind of temper the tone down. Because I think it makes it really hard. And I know that for those of you that are on the Ending Racism Committee, you know, generally it's the same people there. So you're preaching to the choir. And we just have to realize as other people come in, they probably won't have the same background and perspective, and it may take a while to kind of come up the curve.
Yeah, and it's important if somebody felt like they got cut off or they did something wrong, that there are people with whom they can get a better understanding so they can do better in the future. And that was one of the things that was really emphasized. People make mistakes, but it's important to understand how you stepped on toes or worse, and be able to do it in a way that doesn't burden your friends who are people of color or the few people of color in a predominantly white congregation. But to have white people who can say, yeah, I can see your perspective, and, you know, let's talk about it so that you can understand how to do it better.
Well, one thing I'm going to talk about a little bit in my synopsis was where I heard the most about sensitivities was related to gender identity and pronouns used in language, and even terms used around disabled people. So there were some sessions where there was that whole flood. So there are sensitivities on issues beyond race and whatever elements of other diversity that I think really always play into things significantly as well.
All right, Lisa, do you want to go ahead and do your report?
Sure. So as you all know, from the notes, I went to quite a few workshops, but I'm going to talk about two things in particular related to attending Blue programming and my overall impressions of GA. So Black Lives of Unitarian Universalists, referred to as Blue, held several activities. One was a program launch, and I attended that, and they're launching two programs called Blue Havens and Harbors. For background, these evolved from a survey Blue conducted in 2017, and my interpretation is key themes from the survey are respondents felt a deep sense of isolation, didn't always feel welcome in local UU congregations, or felt that organizing from a faith perspective with other Black UUs would be beneficial to them. So to address those findings from the survey, Blue developed and is implementing two new programs over the next 3 to 6 months. Both need to be led locally by someone who's Black, and over 50% of the activity planned by each group must be exclusively for Black people. So one program is called Blue Haven, and it's social and social justice oriented, sort of like a meetup, what people would think of as a meetup. The requirements are that group would meet 4 times a year. It doesn't have to be in a congregation independent of COVID. You know, it can be whatever type of social meeting, a minimum of 3 participants, and applications to develop that program will start in September. and the applications would go through Blue. The other is more spiritually focused, and that's called Blue Harbor. And it has 4 purposes. I put that in the notes. That would meet monthly. There should be a minimum of 10 people engaged in that. And the applications for that may start or planned in that start of the year, the 2021 timeframe. Both of these groups should have a UU congregation affiliation, and the UUA totally supports these programs. There's a press release issued by the UUA that states, the UUA is partnering with Blue on the Havens and Harbors Initiative to develop local nodes of Black communities within Unitarian Universalism. These groups will be woven into the UUA infrastructure, and the UUA staff will help support the congregations that host these havens and harbors. The partnership in growing havens and harbors and the partnership of UU host congregations are both an act of reparation and a commitment to a shared future. So that's a very strong backing, and it actually fits so nicely into other things we've talked about earlier. Now, personally, I hope to get more information about the programs and talk to some people to pursue a Blue Haven affiliated with USG. The other programming I went to with Blue was the Blue Worship Service that was held on Saturday evening. It was great. Over 120 people were signed in, and it was just so lively. People were so delighted to see each other virtually. So there are people from all across the country, and you wouldn't even know it was a virtual interaction because in the chat, they were chit-chatting along with everybody a lot. My overall reflections, GA was a great experience. There was a strong focus on so many dimensions of equity, first by learning the associated history, as some of you have talked to, but then by also sharing whatever anti-oppressive actions needed. And the range of diversity was striking to me. There were topics related to anti-racism for Blacks, people of color, and Indigenous people, but also for those differently able, those with a range of gender identities, etc. The rationale for having these separate groups was explained and fully supported. Interestingly to me, as I just alluded to earlier, there were lots of comment related to terms used and sensitivities in the chat section of some sessions that just blew my mind. I mean, like hundreds of comments. So with that, I was struck by the availability of pastoral care and right relations for people to support the UUA participants. And these 2 resources were re-emphasized each day. I have never been in an environment where that type of support was promoted or actually even needed. So that's my synopsis. Any questions? Nope.
I'm unmuting everybody. I muted everybody again because there was noise. I'm a noise police.
Oh, Lisa, I have a question.
Oh, Tanika, I can see your mouth moving, but can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I can. I'll write your question in the chat. Go ahead, Tanika.
So my question was the difference between Haven and Harbor. Haven is more of a social kind of exchange for people. But what about, is Harbor, how does Harbor, how is that distinctive from Haven?
You didn't go, so it's about what a harbor is. Go a little more detail about what a harbor is, Lisa.
So a haven is like a social group, like I said, like a meetup. So they're anticipating, you know, oh, some people are traveling to Philly, or if there were some Black people from Restoration, USG, and First U, and we wanted to get together, you know, in the park, or even to the extent that you build this network of UU, or as they call them, UU adjacent people, people that have a common social justice interest, you would get together and then go participate in a rally or some kind of social justice function together. Whereas the Blue Harbor is basically developing a spiritual worship infrastructure. So that's why the expectation is that group would meet monthly. So if there are people who are considering going into ministry, becoming community ministers and something like that, they could use that setting to, you know, establish their skills and share with their community. So it's very different. Yeah, very different.
And Lisa, it's thought that these things would happen virtually.
Yeah, it's my computer again because I can't hear you, Treva.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Lisa, you can't hear anybody?
No. Her computer does this sometimes.
The question about happen virtually until after COVID, yes, unless people are comfortable with whatever level of social distancing for whatever other realm of activity. But since each has to be associated with the congregation, there's no way that people can plan to meet in person unless that was allowed by that. There's no way that someone can plan to meet in person in a UU church structure, whatever, unless it was allowed by that congregation.
Okay, are there any other questions for Lisa? I can type them into the chat quick so she can hear them. I don't know why she can't hear, but this does happen. Periodically, we're meeting with Lisa and she can't hear us.
Oh,
Anybody?
Well, I'm kind of wondering, I know some Black Quakers who live in Northwest Philly. In order to have enough people for the social groups, would it be possible to open it up to adjacent religious people once the Blue Havens are established?
She said it would, there could be, and it's only, you only need 3 for Blue Havens. Oops, she
Okay.
dropped off. You only need 3 people for Blue Havens. Harbors takes
Okay.
10. But yeah, she said UUs or UU adjacent. So if there were interested Black Quakers, I think that would qualify.
I wouldn't want to start pointing my friends to Lisa until, you know, the Unitarians kind of had ownership of the Haven.
Right, until she figures out if she's going to reach out to some people and see if she can make it happen. And then I think
Great.
once she starts saying that it's happening, then absolutely, I think you could see if other people were interested. She also said what she was saying about it has to be run by Black people and it has to be only Black people a certain number of time. But because some people have partners or children who are mixed race or white, other ethnicities would be welcome. Let me unmute you, Lisa. I'm unmuting you. Can you hear us now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So Margaret
Yes.
was asking if Black Quakers would be welcome, and I was just saying yes, they would be once you get it figured out if it's happening.
Right, right. And your explanation for why 50% Black, realizing that there are all kinds of other relationships with people who don't identify totally as Black, and for the reasons of comfort, not feeling the need to explain whatever cultural elements, that's why they want the majority of the function to be exclusively Black. But I think it's a good opportunity to help strengthen relationships. And, you know, as much as we've talked within USG, culturally, even people who appear as Black at USG have different ethnic backgrounds. So the wider you can cast the net to find people that may have similar cultural interests, that keep you engaged with UU, as opposed to people then straying from UU because, oh, they feel like more like home with their friends in the Baptist or, you know, whatever other setting. I see as an opportunity to strengthen as opposed to dilute. And hopefully that will be the effect. I also just thought it was so amazing that in the UUA statement, they specifically said that they felt building this was an act of reparation, which I could appreciate far more than that other reparation discussion.
All right. Any other questions for Lisa or questions about anything else about GA before we wrap up? Just unmuting everybody again, I think. It's not Eric. I asked you to unmute.
What is happening with Eric? Poor thing.
Well, Shobi needed the computer, so he had to move. And then I muted him because he cleared his throat once.
And now unmute yourself.
I'm asking him to unmute. I guess he doesn't have anything to say.
I just want to say one thing.
That's all. I don't want to unmute. It's fine.
That's fine. Yeah, Betsy.
I just want to say one thing. At our house, Joan is referred to as our Joan.
Yeah, she was special. She is special. That was a wonderful service.
It was. And it was recorded, you know, way ahead of time. And I thought, well, that's a potentially really big problem. But, you know, it was just as relevant as if she was going to give the George Floyd murder as an example, because it was really relevant about change and about what society has to look like.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd just like to thank everybody for doing this, and for one for going, and then for being willing to report to our congregation. And I've come to reports on GA many times, and this is absolutely the best one so far.
Well, that's because you had such personalized attention. We 7 of us to talk to 2 people.
Well, hopefully folks will go to Trevis page and get some of your summaries. And we just got to push that this is available, and it's really worth doing.
Well, it was helpful for me because even though I went to quite a few sessions, I didn't go to all of them. And it's nice to hear a verbal synopsis of your peers than, you know, just reading the slides after the fact. So I enjoyed it. I guess if I had been thinking, I would have had little treats and snacks and sat here and really enjoyed myself to do our social time.
I brought my tea.
I agree, Lisa. It was very useful to look at being able to talk about what you had heard. And I actually re-listened to both those noon talks. And as I told you, I researched, you know, the discovery, which I had not researched before. And to get the exact wording was very, very interesting.
The other thing I found interesting is because I was just so wiped out. You know, the first thing starts at 9 in the morning, and generally there were things up until at 9 or 10 at night. And, you know, I still have a life to live and food and the dog and all of that. So I was consistently skipping the part of the day that was entitled Reflections. And that's where people would just gather. And I didn't bother to put the app on my phone because I don't want to bug out my phone, you know, overloading and conversing with people. But it was only after the Sunday service that I joined the chat afterwards. And I think I was in a group of about 6 or 7 people. And we interacted just like we were standing next to each other at USG. And we were so happy to talk. And there were other people on welcoming, and we were sharing. And then we shared our contact information. And I thought, oh, I guess I could have done this earlier.
Can I add?
Now I know.
I don't think any of us talked about Howard Bryant's talk, which was very interesting. I think somebody included it in the write-up.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, and there was one thing he said that I've really been sitting with, where he talked about white men consider themselves the owners of America, and all the rest of us are renters. And I look at the white supremacists on the news, and it's like, yeah, they think they own this place, and they don't. And that's why they're so upset. Or at least a major reason why they're so upset.
Yeah, I really enjoyed his talk as well. And I was texting a friend of mine, oh, here's this guy that's talking in our UUA General Assembly. I never heard of him. I don't pay attention to ESPN, but it wasn't sports related. And he was very engaging. The format was good. It's like, oh, a new fan. I'll get his book. Let me see.
Well, I loved what he said, but he moved the whole time. It made me, I had to like not watch him because he was all over the place. That did make me a little bit dizzy, but what he said was amazing.
He didn't move quite that much, Treva.
He moved a lot.
But yeah, he was like literally leaning in as he talked. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, it was really good.
It was also, is the Ware lecture available?
Not the last time
generally?
I'll keep looking, and as soon as it is, I'll pop it onto the page. It's not yet.
That was great.
It's not, most years it's not usually available. They make you pay for it.
Yeah,
Oh.
that's right.
They said they thought it would be available after a delay, and if you look at the Ware lecture page, there are some of them that are linked, but not all of them. And I think it partly depends. Like Brian Stevenson didn't want his available, and it wasn't about money; it was about privacy, I think. But you go to the Ware lecture page, and you can see some of them are linked. So they did say it would be available eventually. So I just
good.
The other session I went to, well, there are three that I also went to that I like, but one was talking about leading breakthroughs in congregations and communities. And they really got into innovative ways to do programming and a framework and all of this other stuff. And when they talk about programming, they're talking about to attract new people, not just new ways to do programming within. So I recommend people take a look at that as well.
What session was that?
306, leading breakthroughs in congregations and communities.
Okay. Do you know the number?
306.
Thank you. Oh, I found it. Okay.
all right.
There's something else interesting about doing virtual instead of in person is that in some ways it was possible to get to more things. Like I might have skipped a noon lecture if I had to get lunch, because I mean you're ending one thing at 11:30, and the time between sessions is so short. When you have to physically get to different places, when you have to feed yourself, go to the bathroom, all these things, it gets really hard to go to one thing right after another. And that was actually easier on the virtual. I mean, because you could eat lunch, you could be making lunch and listening to something at the same time.
Right.
Yeah, I actually found I had a little bit of time to exercise, which I don't usually at GA, because the worship is at 8 a.m. And if I'm not getting up at 6 to exercise because I'm not getting to bed,
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I love the morning worship. I was on the morning worship every morning at 9, and that was such a beautiful way to sort of ground and start the day to me.
Mm-hmm.
But I could sit there with my breakfast, I didn't have to have eaten and done everything by then. So.
The other thing that was different, well, not different, but interesting for me, so I've never gone to a church big get together. And so my concept, I think I even kind of rolled my eyes when Treva, Eric, or Crystal tried to tell me, oh yeah, you should go. And I'm thinking, oh, I don't see me sitting through a church convention. But yeah, that's me, that's honest. But it's so interesting that you really are in very different tracks with this. There's things you can do for your own spiritual growth. There's things related to your church and community. And then there's the infrastructure of UA. Eric just sent me a text consistent with my common thing, like I had to make sure this whole UU thing wasn't a cult. So you have these different tracks, and with so much going on, you could focus on your own spiritual, but there's so much other learning and activity too. So that makes it, I don't even know what word I could use for it to kind of engage other people who may have had the thinking I had before. The fact that if it's virtual, it only costs $150 helps a lot. But, as opposed to spending several thousand.
They did say they're trying to decide right now whether to just go ahead and plan virtual for 2021. So they'll have a whole year to plan it rather than trying to do it in 3 months. And then they're also thinking that perhaps they would alternate, and 1 year be in person and 1 year it would be virtual, just both for climate change reasons and for accessibility reasons. So they're thinking it really went extremely well. Bob attended a conference recently that was just an absolute technological nightmare. And compared to that, GA had a couple of hiccups, but for the most part, it worked really amazingly well.
Yeah, that I definitely would witness several sessions with major technical problems. I mean, I was sending messages to their tech services and things, the volume messing up and stuff like that. I also highly suggest to them that they do it on a platform where they can have Q&A separate from chat. And I know there's another setting that I participate in and where they're separate, because truly in one of those sessions, there was so much banter going on about someone mistakenly used the wrong pronoun or term and all of the sensitivity, so that the speakers couldn't find the real questions. So those are the kind of things they can take into account, because some of the chat is engaging and helpful. So, you don't want to cut out that completely, but you do need to be able to find the questions separate from stuff like that.
It was funny. I went to one and it had 650 people on it. And the guy it was Chris Crass who was speaking, and he's like, all right, let's unmute everybody and hear from a couple of people. I'm like, unmute 650 people? No, don't do that.
Right. And they had a hard time figuring how to get people in breakout groups the first 2 days, but by the third day they figured it out and stuff like that.
Zoom won't put you in a breakout if your meeting has more than 500 people. So then, like, that meeting was 650, so they had to create a second meeting, put 300 people in the separate meeting, and then create breakout groups.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Well, thank you all. Eric, thank you for coming.
Even though you got muted.
Organizing it. It was wonderful for us to hear each other sharing. It was great.
Yeah, no, that was good. I think it was good. Yeah, this is only the third time I've done GA, but I think sharing it virtually really has a lot of advantages. So, all right.
Okay.
Good to see you all.
Yes.
Have a good rest of your day. Take care. And the Google Doc can be added to anytime. So if you see another session and you want to put another post in there, it can be added to any time. And if you can't figure out how to add it, just email it to me and I'll add it for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Sarah's back.
Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Bye. Sarah's getting back on and we're all leaving.
Yep. I just didn't want to shut her out. So Lisa, you're going to go ahead and do Betsy, you needed to be unmuted. I'm sorry. Yes. What's up?
Thank you. Yes. I have only been able online to find the things that were public. Does anybody know how to get into, like, I wanted to go back to some of the sessions that I heard and I couldn't find them or get into them.
You have to go back through the portal. So go into your email where it says, join us in the portal or whatever, and click that, and that will put you back in.
Okay. I think maybe that's lost on my computer, but I'll look for it.
Yeah, I think they're individualized, so I don't think I could send you mine and it would work for you.
No, it wouldn't.
I would search GA portal, and if you still can't get in, I would email somebody at the UUA and just say, can you refresh my portal for me? Because we should have access to it through the summer.
Okay, that's what I'll do. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I've definitely gone and watched some that I hadn't experienced live.
Yep. Yeah, I know Zachary said he'd be watching them all summer.
Yeah, you could watch them. You could watch them for the whole next year. There's so much material.
Well, we won't have access for the whole year.
Yeah, but I'm going to actually go back and watch the two worships morning worship services that I didn't catch since Nan, you have advertised them so nicely.
Yeah, they're worth it. They're definitely worth it. All right. Anything else,
All right.
Sarah? We
I-
love you back.
Trying to copy the chat, and every time I did, I would get disconnected.
Oh, well, Lisa's going to copy it. She can send it to you maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I copied
did.
it.
Okay, I did learn how to do it, but it's been knocking me off the Zoom when I try to do it.
Oh,
Okay.
that's weird.
Yeah, I'll send it to you. I copied it.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.